Thank you, everyone, for joining. Welcome to the Insights at Questrom webinar series. My name is Pete Howard, Professor of Practice and Executive Director of the Digital Business Institute here at the Questrom School of Business. Point of housekeeping, love to have active questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A box to enter your questions and we'll address them towards the end. Also, please note that this is being recorded, so your presumed consent is taken by being on this. Thank you. So I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Carrie Morewedge, Professor of Marketing and Everett W. Lloyd Distinguished Faculty Scholar. Carrie researches causes, consequences, and the correction of physiological biases in human judgment and decision-making. His research focuses in particular on how they influence the value that consumers see in experiences and material goods and new technologies, often more than the physical properties or market value of those experiences, goods, and technologies. Today, we're talking about Professor Morewedge's recent article, Preference for Human, Not Algorithmic Aversion. So welcome, Carrie.
Thanks, Pete. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, why don't we jump right in then? So why don't we start with the basic question? What's an algorithm?
Well, basically, an algorithm is a rule, and it typically specifies the relationship between data and outcomes or inputs and outcomes. You could think about a recipe being an algorithm for baking bread. But more generally, we tend to use algorithms in the kinds of algorithms that my work intersects with tend to work in the context of decision making. And algorithms could be anything from a simple decision rule, like buy the cheapest option or buy the highest quality option. An algorithm could be a linear model, like a regression, where people pick what variables to use, and the model determines how to weight those variables when predicting some kind of outcome. So for example, we could look at graduate admissions and look at things like GPA and GMAT scores and letters of recommendation and weight the algorithm to decide what's the best kind of predictor of something like starting salary after graduation when we're thinking about how to weight those variables. Or an algorithm could be a more complex model like a random forest, where the algorithm selects which combinations of variables will be used and relationships between data and outcomes. And so these kinds of algorithms, and we can think about them as being supervised machine learning, humans picking the data and the outcome, but the algorithm might explore different kinds of relationships that would not be apparent or testable by a human. So for example, if you're trying to predict the market value of a house, you might an algorithm might detect something like houses with more than 2 bathrooms are worth more, but only if they have 3 bedrooms and a certain number of square footage. So it's testing these kinds of complex interactions that might not occur to a human or that a human wouldn't have time to like pre-specify. So in general, again, we think about any kind of algorithm as a decision rule. I think the types of algorithms that come to mind for most of us thinking about this in the space right now are algorithms that where people are collaborating with computers. So in these kinds of cases, not a simple decision rule where a person is determining the inputs and outputs and engaging in the computation in their mind. In most kinds of cases, when we're talking about algorithms in this space, we're talking about a collaboration between a person and a computer.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it helps to just get that baseline because it's such a commonly used term that it's good to get the base. So what's the news in your article, or how do algorithms make collaborative decisions with humans, and what is the interaction?
Yeah, so I think a common misconception in this space is that algorithms are making decisions on their own, and I think it's helpful to begin by thinking that in all cases humans are specifying which variables and which algorithms will use to make predictions. So any decision made by an algorithm is a collaboration with a human. And I have a chart that I think will be helpful in for showing people what that looks like. So let's take a simple kind of random forest. Or sorry, so let's take a simple kind of decision rule. Can you see the table that I put up?
Yes.
Great. Let's take a simple kind of decision rule. And in this kind of case, this is something that a person is using to help them guide their own decision making. And there, you could think that, and in this case, there's data or variables. There are cases or rows in a spreadsheet, and there's some kind of objective that one's trying to figure out. So like, for example, what's going to be the best, what's going to be the best pizza I could find tonight, right? And so if I'm trying to find the best place to order pizza from, I might decide my decision rule will be choose the highest rated restaurant, right? So I could build a consideration set of all places that deliver to my house, then look at their star ratings and simply choose the option with the highest star rating, for example. But then we can get into cases that are more sophisticated, where we have supervised learning, where in this case, the algorithm is doing some kind of learning that's supervised by the human. And you can think about a basic kind of case there is like a linear model. So here, people are, again, choosing the data, they're choosing the rows, they're choosing the objective. Humans are also choosing what the relationship is between data and objectives, right? So which kinds of variables are we looking at as predictors? What kinds of interactions are we looking at? And in these kinds of cases, the algorithm is determining how to weight those different kinds of variables, but humans are still involved in a lot of decision-making in these kinds of processes. Now, if we get into more kinds of complex supervised learning processes that people might talk about commonly in the news, like decision trees or random forest models, there again, humans are still choosing the data and the rows and the objectives. And in many cases, either an algorithm or a person is choosing what features are going to be used. So features are basically, you could think about it as combinations of variables used to make predictions. And the algorithm can explore more kinds of combinations of predictors for a particular outcome and how they're all related in ways that a human could not. And that's not to say that the algorithm will do that the same in each kind of instance, but in these, what's really important to note is that in all of these different kinds of models, humans still have a lot of decision-making power and control. So humans are making these kinds of critical kinds of choices about, if we want to build an algorithm to hire someone, we have to decide what is the algorithm trying to predict in that hiring decision, right? So is it trying to try to predict people like those people we hired in the past? Is it going to try to predict people like those who receive positive performance evaluations? Is it trying to predict people who, bring in more patents for the company or raise more sales, right? So the humans are choosing the particular kinds of objectives. They're choosing what data to put in all of these kinds of cases. And even in reinforcement learning models where the algorithm is adding more cases as it goes to explore, humans are still choosing what kinds of variables it's looking at and what kinds of outcome it's trying to predict. So I just want to show that like in all the different kinds of algorithms people talk about, these are not just like black boxes that we have no idea about what they're doing. We have a clear idea about what they're trying to predict and what kind of data they're using to make those kinds of predictions. And so if we build from that kind of idea, then we can start thinking about, okay, well, if we assume that everything here is a collaboration between an algorithm and a human, then how are ways of structuring these kinds of choices? Because let's take a case that almost everyone is using right now, like GPS, right? So if I want to go from my office to my home, I know there are multiple different kinds of routes. I know all of the routes that I could take home. But at the same time, I might rely on an algorithm like Waze just to help me figure out what's the fastest way right now, right? So I might look at Waze and try to figure out, okay, which is the fastest route? And if that route doesn't make sense to me, I might override it. And in that case, the algorithm is making a decision and I'm monitoring that kind of choice. In other kinds of cases, people are making decisions, like think about like a typical word processing software. You might write out some kind of letter, and then an algorithm is engaging in grammar and spell checking for you, and it's double checking and bringing to your awareness cases where it thinks you might be making an error. So that's the second kind of collaboration where the human is making the decisions and the algorithm is engaging in this kind of monitoring process. And in a third case, humans are choosing the variables and objectives, but algorithms are making decisions and monitoring them. And you could think about that. That's more common in like B2B kinds of contexts. For example, like online ad bidding. So how, different kinds of online advertisement banners are determined. in real time, or you could think about weather forecasting, but you could still think of these kinds of decisions as being collaborative because people are specifying what data to be used and what outcomes it's trying to predict, whether it's click-through rates or other kinds of metrics that people might want to maximize.
Great. That's very interesting. So you've described collaboration scenarios, but what about algorithms replacing humans altogether? Where is that happening?
Yeah, I would say that the place where you see algorithms replacing people, you see that in a lot of kinds of more professional kinds of contexts. So you might see algorithms providing information that people used to do. Journalism is a great example. So in journalism, algorithms are now writing quarterly reports for a lot of about companies. And so, most of the information that's coming from the company is the same each quarter. And so the algorithm basically drafts an initial report in some kind of format, right? So you don't have to do, floral writing for a quarterly earnings report. And so the algorithm is capturing all of this data, it's plugging in all the information. And then what's interesting about that is it's not necessarily replacing journalists in terms of from like employment statistics. Actually, what it's doing is it's allowing journalists to do more investigative reports, trying to think about, okay, well, here are some reports that look unusual. So now the journalists are not spending all their time doing these sort of very formulaic kinds of reports. They can start to look at the numbers and call people, do interviews, try to figure out why something might not necessarily match up with what they would expect, or get more information about what the reports mean. And you can see that also in other journalism has a couple other really nice examples of that. So you think about comment monitoring in most news articles. Most kinds of algorithms are doing most of that kind of work right now for journalists. And algorithms are also helping gather and amass data in ways that people could do, but would be sort of excruciatingly time consuming and mind numbing to do. So for example, the Panama Papers was a collection of about more than 2 terabytes worth of documents, and algorithms went through and scanned all of that financial information and organized it so that investigative journalists could then extract like the summaries of that kind of information and base their papers on that. And so, without algorithms doing that kind of work, journalists couldn't have written those stories. In some cases, algorithms are replacing what journalists were doing in those kinds of spaces, like writing the basic reports, but that's not necessarily taking away their jobs. It's changing sort of the nature of how they're spending their time. There are places where algorithms are taking away what people are doing. So if you think about like in the medical space, algorithms are doing a lot of kinds of radiology, for example, in ways that are providing input to a radiologist, but algorithms are in some cases better at capturing more complex kinds of information, like in mammography, for example. Algorithms can sometimes detect cancer much earlier than a human radiologist could. And so they're serving as input to a specialist decision in that case.
Wow, no, that's fascinating. Right.
Yeah, but so it's really interesting about the forecasts, though, because there's a famous paper by Frey and Osborne that's probably the most famous one about replacement. And their estimate is that algorithms will take over about 47% of what people do in the next decade or two. And what they're trying to think about are like what kinds of things predict when automation and algorithms will take over different kinds of jobs. And they think the kinds of jobs that are more immune to these kinds of replacements are cases where you really have to have fine motor skills, in cases where there's not a lot of regularity, like dentistry, for example. So replacing a crown or like doing dental work requires each person's mouth is different, and so there's a lot of sort of fine motor movement there that's difficult to do, and that would be difficult for a robot to do, for example. So it's difficult to automate. And then the other kinds of things that are really interesting that they find to be more resistant are things that are require a lot of social intelligence or creative intelligence. And it's not because we don't have enough data to do these things, but because it's so hard for people to specify what kind of outcome should be predicted for the algorithm. And so you could think about, like, how do you specify what makes a poem good, or what makes a joke funny, right? Or what's a good idea? And so those kinds of articulation problems, the problems that we have about explaining how we make our own judgments, are some of the kinds of places where they see the greatest frictions in automation and facilitation or outsourcing. Even though we're seeing some really exciting things in these like generative artificial intelligence programs like GPT-3 or DALL-E, right, that are creating text or creating images, in those kinds of cases, it's, there's different kinds of ways of building algorithms, and we can talk about that too, like how we might get to those kinds of spaces as well.
Yeah, I heard a good one today in a class talking about customer service and AI versus human customer service, right? And the fact that it could take so much time for a human to go find a customer's record, the order history, what happened, where's their package, et cetera, and then come back with a resolution. The AI could augment that, right? To find it all instantly, but still have the human making the decision based on the customer and the conversation. Right?
Yeah, and that's it. Right now, one of the biggest problems is thinking about, like, how do you take predictions and map them to new contexts, right? So AIs may not be as context sensitive to like the nature of the question right now, if it's a novel kind of context. So if you build a chatbot to handle loans, right, and it's good at predicting loans in like for one particular kind of segment, like home loans, it may have trouble moving into a space like car loans, or like credit card, kind of credit card spaces, because the kinds of training that it has is on a different kind of set. Or if you think about like an autonomous vehicle that's been trained to drive in Boston, it may think that it's very normal for people to run a red light if the light just turned, right? And so people in Boston may be like, careful and like waiting for that to happen. When the light changes, you may not like suddenly go through the light because you think someone may run it. But an algorithm that like is in a much more like law-abiding city, that's trained in law-abiding city, would do very poorly in Boston because of like people's sort of like reckless driving here.
Yes.
So
Great.
to think about like, algorithms learn in a context, and they extract information from that space.
Wonderful. So, just getting further into your research, when we think about trusting decisions made by algorithms versus humans, how do you or other scientists measure that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's sort of two ways to think about it. One is the sort of classic way that people have been doing this for a long time is to look at people's relative preference for a human versus an algorithm. So for example, you'd say, there are different levels of automation in driving. What level of automation would you prefer? Where like 1 is you do everything and 7 is the car does everything, right? Or you could say, what would your be willingness, like imagine you had, and I've done this myself, like you say, like, would you rather, imagine you were assigned a human radiologist, how much would you be willing to pay to switch to an AI with comparable performance? Or if you were assigned an AI, how much would you be willing to pay to switch to a human? So in these kinds of cases, we're testing people's relative preferences, and we're making both kinds of human and AI services or providers or decision makers or services salient. A different way to do it is say, here's the service, how likely would you be to utilize it? And in that way, we're less susceptible to, we have a better sense of like where's the directionality of preferences? Is it that people like humans, or is it that people dislike AIs, right? Are we prejudiced against algorithms, or do we have a fondness for humans that may be irrational at sometimes?
Got it. So in general, do people trust algorithms?
So that's a mixed story, right? So there's evidence in the literature for what is called algorithm aversion. So in many cases, people, for example, trust humans to make decisions like, what's a funny joke? Or driving right now. People would rather have a person making those kinds of choices than an algorithm. That may be partially history, but that kind of documentation is there. We also see cases of algorithm appreciation, where people, in many cases, would prefer to rely on an algorithm than a human. Like, for example, if you have to go somewhere, let's say that you're going to your friend's house and they know where you live, when's the last time you asked them for directions? Right? Like, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? GPS wayfinding is so good now, right?
Right.
That like you may have traveled a route, but you still use the GPS, right? And interestingly, when people are driving with GPS, they don't encode the route as well as people who are not using GPS. So in simulators, so people who are driving with GPS are as fast when they have to go without it as people who never drove that route before. So like there's we're outsourcing. GPS isn't just telling us how to go. We're outsourcing a lot of the kinds of things that we would normally do when we're driving to GPS, like thinking about landmarks and spatial navigation and where we are in a place. And so there's amazing things that are happening, right? So if you think about in London, for a long time, it was excruciatingly difficult to become a cab driver because you had to memorize the entire map of the city and know every route from one place to another. Now GPS, like, someone can go there, like either of us could go to London, as long as we're comfortable driving on the left side of the road, plug in like Google Maps and, drive for Uber. And that would be, we'd be able to get around where we need to go. Maybe not as efficiently, but like we'd be able to do like 90% of what people were doing before. So in these kinds of cases, people are preferring to rely on algorithms. And it's even in the financial sector, we see that as well, that people are more comfortable often like relying on an algorithm than a human advisor. When thinking about like what kind of mix of a portfolio of assets do I want to invest my retirement in. So it's a mixed story, and
Yeah.
it's interesting because in general, when you read the literature, people are talking about algorithm aversion as this general kind of thing that we have, that people don't like algorithms. And I think it like taps into a lot of popular imagery where people are worried about things like, algorithms taking over humans, like in a Matrix or like Terminator kind of experience, right? Like that's sort of like the latent kind of fear that people have in a lot of cases, where people are really legitimately concerned about losing their jobs to algorithms. That I think that's at the forefront of like many people's concerns. And you saw that even sort of starting to surface in political conversations like Andrew Yang's campaign, where you're talking about things like we need to have universal basic income because everyone's going to be, a large portion of our population is going to be like what they do every day will be replaced by algorithms. So I think that there's both a trust and a distrust of algorithms. And it's not that it's this domain general kind of thing. I think that people are really concerned about, they're threatened by algorithms in places where they feel algorithms are going to replace things at which they do well, or things at which they feel like are important to their identity. So if you look at preferences for relying on algorithms versus human judgment, what's really interesting is that experts actually, there's kind of a U curve for adoption in terms of expertise. So people who don't really understand the benefits of using algorithms may be reticent to use them. But most people in some kind of skill task or decision will rely on algorithms, except for experts. And experts actually will tend to under rely on algorithms. And we also see that kind of hesitance to engage in or rely on algorithms in cases where people like strongly identify. So for example, like I love driving, and I like had a manual transmission car before I had an EV, and like really enjoyed that. And it was, very strange to me to think about like just getting in a car and telling it where I wanted to go, even though that would like allow me to do many other kinds of things that would be like, talk to my kids, like do some work, like watch a movie, whatever. It's not like driving in Boston traffic is a riveting experience. So what, like, why is that a threat? Well, it's something that you identify with. And you see the same thing is true for things like baking or biking or cooking, right? People are hesitant to rely on different kinds of automation in these kinds of spaces where they have an identification with that kind of task. And it's interesting, like in the cases where social scientists are saying algorithms won't take over what people do, it's like in the things that social scientists specialize in, like social intelligence and creative intelligence, right? So like social scientists think of themselves as like understanding human behavior, right? And that's a core part of their identity. They don't think that algorithms can do that.
Yeah, and I guess, you've kind of covered what this tells us about, when people will, or when and how people will trust algorithms or not. But so I guess it depends on their own expertise, their own biases, right?
Well,
Anything else on that?
yeah, I mean, I would think there are sort of two kinds of human-centric biases that lead to this. One is that in a lot of cases, the opacity of algorithms leads people not to trust them. So many people recognize that they don't understand how algorithms are making predictions. And, if you looked at how the algorithm is making predictions, it often isn't that informative. So many kinds of variables are highly correlated with each other in large data sets. And so algorithms might choose a particular kind of variable to weight or not out of a set of like variables that are highly correlated. And so it's not totally clear, even if you had access to the parameter weights that algorithms are assigning to features, why the algorithm chose that particular feature. So if you thought about, let's say that you're trying to do something like predict, the value of a home. There are lots of kinds of inputs. You could think about square footage. You could think about the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms, and there are all kinds of interactions and variables between them. And so the algorithm might choose like one of these highly correlated kinds of variables to get more weight than another variable. But if it had a different set of training data, it might make a totally different decision. So a lot of these kinds of decisions are arbitrary, even to the designers. But people find that to be like really aversive if they don't understand how something's making a decision. What's really interesting there is that people actually they believe that they recognize they don't understand how algorithms make decisions, and that kind of lack of subjective knowledge leads people to be less likely to adopt them, just like in any other kind of consumer space, right? So let's imagine Band-Aid came out with new bandages that do something new and there's a new technology there. If you didn't understand how that technology helped your wounds heal faster, you wouldn't want to spend like $3 or $4 more per box of Band-Aids, like to buy new Band-Aids, right? So these kinds of like the gains to technology are dependent in part on people understanding like what the value of those new technologies are. And if people don't understand how algorithms are working, they're insensitive to a lot of the kinds of advantages that algorithms can provide. What's interesting, though, is that people, by contrast to algorithms, people believe they understand how humans make decisions. And if you ask them to actually explain how humans make decisions, they're at chance like making their explanations about like common kinds of things like medical decisions, right? So if you ask people, how well do you understand how an AI makes a decision about whether or not a mole is cancerous or benign, people say, I have no idea. And they're right, like they're at chance in making predictions about or guessing how the AI makes the decision. If you ask them, how well do you understand how a human doctor decides whether a mole is cancerous or benign? People feel like they do understand how the human makes that kind of choice. But if you ask them how human doctors make that kind of choice, like what is the process a dermatologist uses, they're at chance in guessing how the dermatologist makes the decision, right? So we rightly recognize that we don't understand how AIs are making many of the kinds of choices and decisions that they're doing. We tend to overestimate how well we understand how humans are making the comparable decisions, and that's like one source of the friction. Then we get into that kind of threat kind of issue that people feel when things that are important to them are being taken away or being done by someone else, in this case, an algorithm. And then I think there are two kinds of very rational kinds of perspectives that aren't being explored as much in the literature. So one is algorithms need data to work, and specifically to like make decisions, like, think about algorithmic curation. So if you go on Netflix and you don't rate any movies, it's very hard for Netflix to recommend films that you'll enjoy. If you go on Netflix and you rate a lot of different movies, Netflix can now give you better kinds of recommendations. But you're also giving up privacy by telling Netflix what your preferences are, right? Netflix might learn that you have like a penchant for like romantic comedies or action movies or something else that like you might not like want to publicly divulge, but like now this huge multinational corporation has all this information about you, right? So people may be reticent to rely on algorithms in many kinds of cases because giving the algorithms that information could be costly. And so like in the Netflix domain, it's not that costly, but then think about financial algorithms like Mint, right? So Mint now has access to all of your financial information. So it can probably make better recommendations about what credit cards you should be using or what kinds of assets like you're missing in your portfolio, but you're also putting yourself at risk for fraud or other kinds of issues that like wouldn't be there if you didn't share that information. Like the last piece that I think is missing too from the discussion is that the funding models or the business models for a lot of these algorithms creates what we call a principal agent problem, or in the organizational literature, an agency bias. Because in many kinds of cases, algorithms aren't sort of benevolent advisors or recommenders working on your behalf. They're also supported by things like advertising. Like if you look at Google's revenue stream, it's mostly through Google makes its money through advertising, right? And so if you think about Google searches, Google has two kinds of incentives. It has an incentive to provide you with information that's very valuable and like highly related to the search you want. And so the best kind of information that it can find, but it also has an incentive to make money through advertising. And so, in sponsored search, for example. And so, in these kinds of cases, and I think that's less transparent to consumers, but they will become more and more aware as time goes on, that a lot of these kinds of recommendation systems, or a lot of kinds of cases where we're outsourcing decisions to algorithms, might be there are mixed incentives for the algorithmic provider or the firm that's providing that kind of service. And so when consumers aren't the ones paying for it, they're going to be more salient that they're the product, right, in these kinds of situations. So that those are kind of less explored areas that I think will become more explored as adoption becomes more prevalent and consumers become more savvy to like the business fundamentals about how algorithms work.
Wonderful. Reminder to the participants, please enter any questions in the Q&A box. We'd love to have some engaged Q&A. But kind of bringing it back to sort of the bigger picture of businesses and companies and firms, how can they use this learning and this research to increase trust in algorithms for their consumers, assuming that those are the algorithms that they feel are best for their consumers?
Sure. So I think the idea that people have a preference for humans more than an aversion to algorithms, and those kinds of preferences are strongest in domains with which they identify, makes different kinds of predictions than a theory of algorithm aversion. So if you come from the perspective that people are averse to algorithms, a solution would be to anthropomorphize algorithms. So for example, let's go back to that chatbot, right? Or customer service kind of interaction. So imagine I'm a consumer, I'm on an online retailer, and I'm asking them, I want to answer some questions. If we think that people are averse to algorithms, I might want to have a picture of a human and give it a human name, and then have a conversational kind of style where they say hello and like engage in like, a familiar style of social interaction, engage in like some kind of pleasantries before they get into specific kinds of questions, rather than just give consumers some kind of menu or do some kind of search, right? And algorithm aversion, like a perspective that people are averse to algorithms, would suggest that kind of anthropomorphization is going to be helpful. What if we think about humans as just having a preference for humans and not having necessarily a prejudice against algorithms, well then, what are the things that we can do to facilitate adoption? Well, one thing is we can make what the algorithm is doing more obviously an objective task rather than a subjective task. Because one reason why people might have a bias towards humans is because there's a lot of latitude for using different kinds of criteria that prioritize or like benefit humans over algorithms in different kinds of decisions. So, making decisions based on gut kinds of instincts or intuition, right? Seeing decisions being more better made through intuition than like analysis. Another thing that we could do is help explain to people how a lot of the jobs that algorithms are doing are not necessarily central aspects of what makes human expertise special, right? Or what is a central component to their work. So think about like what most people are like, think about a lot of our time at work is spent doing things that like, are important parts of the job, but could be automated, right? Like, there are many times like, you've taught classes before, there are many times that people ask you questions that are on the syllabus, right? And so like, let's imagine that you had an algorithm on your email, and anytime a question came from a student, it was screened about whether or not like the syllabus could answer that question. And then it would just send them that portion of the syllabus, right? Or let's say that you want it like, you were thinking about scheduling software, right? So in many kinds of cases, people would try to go back and forth about meetings, and then you could just have two algorithms try to figure out, here's my open time. Why not, set up meetings in these kinds of spaces? And so that kind of coordination could be outsourced. And I don't think that most people view that as being central to their work, right? So if algorithms are taking on more kinds of work, like, okay, I could have an algorithm go out and scrape the literature for me on a particular task to figure out like, or on a particular idea to like go see what are important kinds of works. That's starting to get into the place where a professor or a graduate student might feel threatened, right? Like, so does the algorithm have the right taste? Like, does it understand what is important? So those are kinds of tasks that you could portray as being arduous kinds of things that you have to do, or things that are more central to like your identity as an expert. And so explaining to people how like that's freeing up time for them to do more kinds of enjoyable or more kinds of creative activities might be one way to get people to rely on algorithms more. So I would say, like in general, making things more objective and explaining to people how a lot of the tasks that algorithms are doing are freeing them to do things they care about more, rather than replacing things that they view as being essential aspects of their work.
Wonderful. We have a question. Bahar, question is, hi, thanks for the very interesting seminar. Welcome. He's saying, my research relates to the human perception of AI. I'm new to the field. I'm wondering whether you are aware of good review papers on the topic. Many thanks. No, we did not talk about this, so good question.
Oh, well, Bahar is a PhD student in our doctoral program here at Questrom. So Bahar, yeah. So there are several good papers. I would think that there is a review paper in the Journal of Behavioral Decision Making that goes through various causes of algorithm aversion. There is an interesting paper in the Journal of Marketing that looks at how people think about different kinds of social functions of algorithms. And I will have a chapter out pretty soon looking at collaborations with algorithms in decision making that builds on some of the work that like today's conversation is based on. So it's trying to look at what algorithms are doing decision spaces, how algorithms are facilitating human decision making by informing and recommending and making decisions on humans' behalf, how algorithms do that, and then talking about different kinds of frictions in like how we design algorithms, whether or not we are designing algorithms towards like, in line with human values, or just simply imitating human judgment. And then thinking about these kinds of frictions in adoption, and then more frictions in like long-term use and how to structure these collaborations. So I'd be happy to share that with you if you're interested.
Excellent. I guess I have a question, Carrie. I mean, do you think there's, or do you see in your research any kind of generational splits, Gen Z versus baby boomers versus millennials, et cetera, or other demographic splits?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've done a lot of work in consumer psychological barriers to technology adoption recently, looking at, for example, why people value physical goods more than digital goods. For like, why do we feel like it's more, I can use the music on my phone. I guess you can't see my phone, but like I can use the music on my phone anywhere and download a book to my phone. If I have a book, like an electronic book, I can read on my phone, I can read on my computer, I can read on a tablet. If I have a physical book, I have to sort of lug it around with me. But people still want to pay more for physical books than digital books, right? And part of that is that you're buying the right to access. You're not buying like the right to sell it, or you may lose access to it at some point in time. But a lot of it's like that we don't have the control over that. And what we see is that like these kinds of phenomena of adoption for technology, I mean, part of it is familiarity, but there's not a huge age effect. A lot of it boils down to these like fundamental kinds of psychological phenomena. Like, I don't want to give up control over things that are like I view as part of my identity, or it feels good to own something, right? Like the feeling of ownership is creates value for me in the things that I use, right? So if I if I feel like I own this phone, like it has more value to me than if it was just a phone that I'm like renting, right? If I'm going to rent a textbook, I don't feel any special attachment to it. But if I buy the textbook, then I see more value in it, even if it is mostly like for, doing well in a class, and I'm not going to use the textbook afterwards that often. So these kinds of psychological frictions are really powerful in thinking about when people adopt new kinds of technology and when people kind of fail to see the value that is there in a lot of kinds of things. Like, you think I'm not sure if you remember this, but for a long time, there was a debate about whether the iPhone would ever like beat the BlackBerry, right? And people get into these kinds of ideas about, people get very familiar, they have to show what we call status quo bias, right? So people think about what they're losing with technological changes more than what they're gaining in these kinds of technological changes. And you think about examples come to mind, like Donald Trump is very, big part of his campaign was talking about light bulbs, right? That he would let you get incandescent light bulbs again. Think about, why are people attached to incandescent light bulbs? They use like 4 times as much electricity as an LED light bulb. They burn out quickly, but people get attached to like the color spectrum, right? And so if you look at the economic value for an average homeowner of replacing all of their light bulbs, is something like from incandescent to, if they're replacing them like 10 or 15 light bulbs, it's something like $2,000 to $4,000 over the course of like 10 years. So would most people pay $2,000 to $4,000 to have that like color temperature of incandescent bulb?
Yeah.
No, but like when people don't think about like the long-term economic impacts, they think about the color changes, right? Or how expensive it is to buy the bulb up front. And so part of my MBA course talks about this kind of phenomena in that adoption of new technology at the end, to kind of tie together a lot of these kinds of themes that how psychological barriers are like profound in getting people to make choices that like make perfect sense from like any kind of economic perspective, right? Or from environmental perspectives too.
Great. Okay, well, we have a couple more questions coming in from Nastaran. Thanks for an interesting talk. I wonder how you see the context related to how people trust AI, for example, healthcare versus organizational HR decisions. And he says, to be more clear, which theory can better help us to understand or investigate these differences? So I guess the part of the question, if I'm reading it correctly, is, context of industry, perhaps healthcare versus organizational HR, and then, are there differences?
Well, I think a big part of it is, how much do people think of it as being these kinds of decisions being objective, right? So, in HR kind of perspective, like when you're interviewing candidates, do you view that as being more subjective in terms of like finding, like how do you define like can you define what a good candidate is? It's in healthcare kinds of spaces, it's easier to say like, try to specify what the objective is, like, is there cancer or not, right? Like, or, like, how will this affect the person's long-term, like, here's a particular kind of blood pressure is like maybe a diagnostic measure, like we want to reduce blood pressure, right? And so we can look at what kind of variables what kinds of activities or treatments can we use to reduce blood pressure. And maybe an algorithm is going to be unique in finding relationships between exercise and different kinds of medication or different kinds of treatments that a human might not find there. And it's going to be easier to make that kind of specification. I think what's really interesting, Nastaran, for thinking about your question is, in an organizational setting, it's often really ambiguous what people are trying to predict. We might agree on like what data should go into the like HR hiring and firing space, right? So we could think about performance, we could think about interviews, we could think about experience and skills. We could think about demonstrated kinds of accomplishments. But how do you predict whom to hire? What is your why outcome, right? Is it the person who's going to generate the most sales? How do you define the best candidate? Is it the person that you like the most, right? The person you'd be most excited to see at work every day? Is it the person who you think is going to be the best, like better than the people that are there? or someone that's going to be a team player, right? So it's very hard to define what those kinds of outcomes are. And in those kinds of spaces, it's often not necessarily worse to go with the human decider and have an algorithmic monitor, right? So one of the big kinds of questions for who should be making the primary decision and who should be monitoring is what kind of uncertainty is inherent in the problem, or what's the primary kind of uncertainty. And we talk about uncertainty, we tend to think about things as being uncertain because of chance, right? So like a roulette game, you know all the possible kinds of outcomes. We just don't know which outcome will happen because it's due to chance, right? And so we can see the whole wheel, we can see every possible outcome, we just chance determines which of those outcomes will happen, right? And in a case of epistemic uncertainty, right? So in many kinds of cases, we just don't know what will happen, right? So there's no uncertainty in the ingredients in a pickle and peanut butter sandwich, but until you've tasted it, you probably wouldn't know how it would taste, right? And so there's some kind of uncertainty there. And so you could think about humans are much better at dealing with problems and decisions where it's very hard to specify what data to use, and it's hard to specify what kind of outcome to use because you need to do that to build an algorithm. Whereas algorithms are much better at kinds of problems where the primary kind of nature of uncertainty is probabilistic. So, it's not necessarily epistemic, or what we call the probabilistic uncertainty aleatory uncertainty. And it's true that humans are probably better for predicting very rare events like black swan types of events than algorithms because they just don't have enough data to do that. But in most kinds of cases, you could think about, the OB kinds of situations are those kinds of cases where you have more epistemic uncertainty about what it means to be the best hire, right? Whereas in the medical kind of space, you have more kinds of aleatory uncertainty about, what is the chance of cancer, right? Here, and it's more about, you can be more you can better specify, or in many cases, you can better specify which variables to use as inputs and what kind of a variable to use as the outcome. So sorry, that's a very long-winded answer to your response.
No, great answer. And we learned about your preference for pickles and peanut butter. Hopefully not. But
I
anyway,
haven't actually had a pickle and peanut butter sandwich, but
pickle and peanut butter sandwich.
probably going to be on some tasting menu in the next year or two. No.
Rania, great insights. Thank you. Could you please elaborate on the types of value that people get out of being augmented by an algorithm? And are you aware of any typologies of value in literature, maybe in psychology? That's pretty much the question.
That's a great question. I don't know of a typology of the different kinds of value people will get out of it. In most kinds of cases, we're trying to improve performance accuracy on some kind of outcome. And one thing, right, I think like an interesting question is, in many kinds of cases, the predictions that algorithms are making are not necessarily like the algorithms are not making the predictions that people want them to make. And so you could think about, maybe a different way of thinking about your question is, in the algorithm literature, or the adoption of algorithm literature, people often talk about alignment problems. And alignment problems are when you think about, is the algorithm making decisions in alignment with human values? So take Compass, for example, which is an algorithm that makes recommendations to judges about who's going to be high risk and low risk for engaging in criminal activities while they're on bail. So Compass is like pretty good at predicting who will engage, like who's likely to engage in recidivism while they're on bail, and reduces the risk of violence in communities. But Compass also has like profound racial biases in the way that it classifies candidates, right? Different kinds of defendants, right? And so it's much more likely to classify Black men, for example, as being higher risk than white men. And so Compass is not thinking about structural kinds of bias in our society and correcting for those kinds of biases when it's evaluating different kinds of candidates. And so Compass, if you think about values, right, like the designers of Compass were trying to think about, okay, well, how do we reduce the risk of violence in a community, but they're not also thinking about norms of like fairness and other kinds of values that people would think about, right? So there are different ways to design algorithms. And so there is some really interesting work by Sharad Goel at Harvard Kennedy School, looking at like different kinds of ways of designing algorithms with different kinds of thresholds to try to look at equity. And Sendamal, Nathan, and colleagues have some interesting papers on algorithmic bias to talk about how do you get at fairness in judicial decisions. Those are really interesting spaces where people are trying to think about how do you, like, what kind of value matters to people? Is it performance or is it about fairness? So, you know, that's thinking about what kind of value should the algorithm be incorporating. What people get out of their relationship with the algorithms is a completely different kind of question, and that's an exciting kind of open space that I haven't seen a lot of work in.
Excellent. Time for one more question, and then we'll give you time to wrap up from Yan Yan. Hi, thanks for the inspiring conversation. Doing research about AI chatbots in healthcare for individual users' medical decision. What kind of roles do you think chatbots will possibly play in this context, in the medical decision process? Do you have any suggestions about how to better use these type of decision support tools? In addition, how to, and here's an interesting question, how to allocate the responsibility between human and AI, as well as the consequence of automating some of these medical services? So there's a process question and a liability question.
Yeah, I mean, so let's unpack that. So first of all, chatbots are now in use in medical kinds of contexts. So in England, chatbots are being used in some cases to triage whether or not people need to go to the ER. So they're being used to, you know, in that kind of context. And so that's a pretty high stakes kind of decision. In a lot of cases, I think people are hesitant to rely on algorithms in the medical space, not only because they view their own health as unique, right? So if I have a cold, you have the cold, right? And so like that, or you have the flu and I have a flu, and you know, people are thinking about their medical kinds of circumstances being unique. And so they want personalized kind of medical care that they don't necessarily see at face value from algorithms. So in a chatbot kind of case, people may have specific kinds of questions that they get frustrated about not being able to answer. So in that kind of space, you could think about structuring chatbots as being, you know, there's two ways to structure it. You could have the chatbot do basic kinds of intake kinds of questions, right? Like that someone might get from when you visit a doctor's office, they ask you a bunch of questions, right? And they take some different kinds of statistics, getting that kind of background information. Chatbots could do that. And then you have the doctor, you know, use that kind of information to make some kind of prediction, or a nurse use that kind of information to make some kind of prediction. The liability question is really interesting because when people interact with algorithms and there's a mistake, people blame themselves. When people interact with another human and the human makes a mistake, they blame that human. And there's a really interesting paper by Promberger and Barron from like 2006, where they're looking at people's preferences for algorithms versus human doctors. And they find that in medical spaces, people sometimes prefer human doctors because they feel like if someone's to be blamed for a bad choice, the human doctor is to blame. If someone's to be blamed for a bad choice when I outsource a decision to an algorithm, it's me. So people don't want that responsibility, and they might even be more hesitant to take on that responsibility when it's someone like their children, right? Like their children's health. So I think in the medical kind of space, you have people believing that they have like very unique kinds of health needs. And so you need to be transparent that algorithms are personalizing their care to people's health needs. And I have a paper with Carol Langoni and Andrea Benezzi that documents a lot of this kind of phenomena even in chatbot spaces. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. It's in the Journal of Consumer Research from 2019. And I could share that link. And then, you know, the other aspect too is the liability issue. And so people will perceive themselves to be liable, but I think a big question for like healthcare systems is thinking about, okay, well, who like, let's say that a hospital uses an algorithm to make a triage decision, and like it makes a bad decision and someone dies at home, right? Well, okay, well, who gets sued? Is it the healthcare system that is using the algorithm? Is it the doctor who like failed to supervise the algorithm's choice or like change it? Is it the maker of the algorithm, right? So there are lots of different kinds of layers for reliabilities happening. And I think that we're going to see this starting to be like a major legal question, particularly like when you think around issues, not only in like the medical space, but also issues like in autonomous vehicles, right? So if, Tesla and GM, for example, have like semi-autonomous vehicles now where they're like, people are, they're not driving, the vehicle is not driving itself, but people don't have to keep their hands on the wheel at all times. So in these kinds of crashes, is the auto manufacturer to blame or is the driver to blame because they didn't proceed, right? And so that kind of liability question is going to be inherent in a lot of kinds of services that are happening. And that's a great question that we don't have a lot of data on. So I would encourage folks who are out there in the research space to go start looking at that question, because that's going to play a huge role in like a lot of different kinds of decisions about when can we adopt algorithms, when we can't, when our insurance company is going to be okay with people using autonomous vehicles, and who has to pay for that kind of insurance.
Well, that's a great place to bring us home. Thank you very much. This is a fantastic conversation. This area of AI is applied to business context, especially around consumer, patient, citizen experiences for businesses and governments and healthcare providers is so rich, and it's going to be one of our big focuses next year for the Digital Business Institute. So thanks for setting the stage. Thanks for all your work. And any final words?
No, thanks for having me. And these have been great questions. Thanks everyone in the audience for joining us and for stimulating the conversation.
Yes, thank you very much to our participants, and the recording will be available on Insights Equestrium, and have a great day.